So we have a few minutes left for questions. I'd like all three of the speakers to come back up to the front to take questions. Okay.
Thank you very much. My question for the first speaker. You said that the goal of neuroscience is to move economics. So let's say 40 years from now, how will you say the goal of neuroscience is to move economics. Let's say 40 years from now, how has economics been moved besides my insurance company giving me an fMRI or a neuroscience scan to see how risk averse I am in what certain type of situations?
Well, I think the goal of neuroeconomics is to move economics, and of course it may be possible that we get better measurement techniques for individual differences. That's true, and scans may help here, although they're also very noisy measures still. So I think for a good reason we do not allow, there are paradigms where I can predict, based on brain activity, whether the individual is breaching a promise the next second or so. We have these techniques, but this is very often average behavior, what we predict on average, okay? But at the individual level, our predictions are not yet very good. And this could change in 40 years from now, I agree. And then we would have also a legal issue whether this will be allowed. But I think insurance companies have already now good methods to find out. For example, in Italy, you get much lower premiums if you are willing to have some gadget some widget in your car that shows how you are driving, and so they get at your car driver's behavior in a very convenient way without brain scans, in a very cheap way, and they find lots of methods. But brain scans may also be a method, but I think that is not related to my talk in the sense that this would not move economics. You know, we need in economics, we are a very theory-driven science, and you need to come up with better theories in the end. I mean, even behavioral economics, there have been now several Nobel Prizes awarded to behavioral economists. First was Kahneman, then Schiller, now Dick Thaler. The behavioral economics started as a very empirically oriented discipline, but in the end we wanted to come up with new models, and that's what people do now. We come up with new models, and we want to have models that predict across broad classes of situations, and that can better explain things that we couldn't explain so far, and also explain the old stuff that we can already explain. So that's how we should proceed, and that would be the task of neuroeconomics. And I hope that Michael will make major progress here in the next few years, and there will be some other people who will join in. And let's see. I'm optimistic that it will work. I mean, I'm trying to convince the people that we should do that. Yeah.
Question of.
So I want to address a similar comment. Thank you. So given that economists are often called on to make broad predictions about economic progress in certain areas over a long term or over several years, and given that neuroimaging is on small populations of people, and we don't yet have gadgets that measure what's going on in our brains, how do you bridge that gap from looking at a small number of individuals to the sorts of broad predictions that economists are called on to make?
I personally, I believe that neuroimaging will not be the way to change economics. neuroimaging helps us in understanding how computational processes are implemented in the brain. But in order to study how a computational process is implemented in the brain, I have to have a computational model. And that's what we do, for example, when we so I have been criticizing revealed preference theory, but Ifat nicely pointed out how useful it still is in even in neuroeconomics research, because what do we do when we measure the encoding of subjective value in the brain? We take literally the revealed preference approach, and we interpret utilities now literally. Okay, I have a utility measure now that I derive from behavior. Now the economists the standard economists would say that number tells you nothing. Okay, that number is just a representation of behavior. But as a neuroeconomist, they say, no, that number tells me something. I use now the numbers I derived from the behavior and use them as a parametric regressor in my brain study and see how brain activity varies with that number. And that's how we identify the value encoding regions. But even here, the economic tool is extremely valuable in finding out the economic model is the computational model in a sense, because it gives me the utility numbers, and then I see how it's implemented in the brain. And so I think the way forward for the research project I envisage is not doing more neuroimaging. The way forward is deriving the essence from neuroscience in the form of the key principles, having a mathematical formulation of them, translate them into economics, into behavioral economics models. And for example, I mean, that's what Mike is doing. Kahneman-Tversky, the fourfold pattern of risk-taking, okay, this famous, robust fourfold pattern of risk-taking, but we don't know where it comes from. It is a behavioral regularity, but we don't know where it comes from. But maybe, Michael, you will be the guy who can tell us where it comes from by providing the micro foundation of that.
Yes, here.
Professor Gottlieb, is there a cognitive process that turns information into knowledge, and can it be measured by neuroscience?
That's a good question.
Yes, and yes, of course. Yes, so, yes, of course, that's an obvious question. So when we talk about information, again, simplifying to the point that we can study it bit by bit, we think about these momentary sampling acts. I pose a question and you can flip a card and find an answer. And of course, in natural behaviors, we do this, but we do this in order to integrate it into a body of knowledge. So I think that what happens, and this is what I think we call curiosity, scientific research. How that happens is stuff that has been discussed about in some domains of psychology. Then started in the 1950s, there are discussions, psychology, philosophy, and so on. Not yet in neuroscience, but I think we can now bring this question into neuroscience. So the way that this has to work, curiosity, is the way it works in Calvin. The questions have to be generated from inside. They have to be generated from memory. So it's a recursive process by which, through which knowledge builds upon itself. Questions are generated from memory. And then at some point you might see a way to answer your question by asking somebody or by reading a newspaper or so on. And then somehow you integrate it into your bigger schema, right? Okay, how this works, I don't know. But what I know at this point is that we can start to ask the question and we can start to think about designing paradigms. So I've been thinking about this a lot in my lab. It's difficult, of course, because you have to constrain somewhat the set of internal models or knowledge that everybody has. But there are some very clever tasks that are out there. For example, I've just seen a task in which people learn the meaning of nonsense words from context. So for example, I tell you, the woman went to the blob, and you don't know what the blob is. And then I tell you, her husband was buried in the blob. And then you know what the blob is, right? And we can manipulate that in a way that, so here we're assessing higher level structures of knowledge, and we can try to see how the context, like the woman went to the, activate certain schema, and then how you start to demand information that can complete those schemas. So I think that we can, yes, we can operationalize and link those processes. We know something about memory. We know something about system of semantic knowledge in the brain. And I think that, yes, we can start to fill these gaps.
We have a question back there.
Thank you. My question is for the moderator. You have rightly started by suggesting that recounting the history of economy and political economy. My question to you is, after I've had this, I've received and heard your presentations, I'm under the impression that there are certain assumptions, and you have said that your organisms of finance are banks, Deutsche Bank and USB. Now, my question is it the purpose of the neurosciences to bring the political sphere outside of economy? Is that what it does?
That it keeps the political sphere outside?
Yes, because political questions have completely been eluded from what we have been presented, capitalism in particular.
I guess I don't particularly take the view that thinking about the possible neuroscientific foundations of decision making is somehow more or less likely to lead to different particular political conclusions. I mean, I wouldn't say it either has a.
But the
I
assumption
wouldn't say it has a political agenda of a particular direction at all.
But the assumption is still that, when we're looking at empirical research, it's always gain that is the normal behavior, as opposed to altruism, for instance, and giving.
Well, I mean, I think Professor Fehr made several references to studies that in fact study the degree to which people behave in selfish behavior or other regarding, sometimes altruistic behavior. I don't think that this program of studying individuals making decisions in particular circumstances either is organized to imply that they don't have altruistic motives or that they do. A lot of his work, in fact, has very directly tried to show that one can show experimentally that many people do have other than purely self-interested motives, and he's tried to study the structure of that and model it.
Maybe I also say something on that. I think that by better understanding how people behave, better understanding human behavior, that has, at the very general level, implications for how we finally will have to design our institutions such that they work for the common interest. I mean, whether I am in favor or against the market depends a lot on how I believe markets take into account individual interests or markets do not take into account individual interests. And the same is true for other institutions, for how I structure organizations, and so on, how I structure incentives, how I design business cultures, and. So, and the way, if we understand human behavior better, we can better design all these things, business culture, institutions, the political process, but there's no direct political implication, so to speak, from the scientific insights. And as always, scientific insights can be used for better or for worse. I mean, can be used by those who have bad intentions, can be used by those who have good intentions. But the knowledge itself helps those who want to improve the world to construct a better world. And I think in this sense, there is a big potential here also for improving the world, yeah?
Dr. Fehr, A non-economic question. One of your first slides indicated that a section of the brain, you change the neurons, which change the decision making.
Yes.
And my question is, how did you do that? Is it a chemical or an X-ray machine, or do I have to be afraid in the future?
Yes. No, it's a joke. No, it's we do this in our case. We do this with transcranial magnetic stimulation. So you hold a magnet onto your skull, and that releases magnetic impulses, and these magnetic impulses disrupt neural firing rates, or make it more difficult to recruit particular brain areas. There are other technologies like the direct current stimulation, transcranial direct current stimulation, and here you just put the cathode and an anode on particular brain areas, and then there is a slight flow of an electrical current flows through the brain, and you can change, for example, up or down regulate certain brain regions with this method. But you would feel when we do this to you, so it cannot be unintended. So you have to agree. It is not possible to do that.
Does it actually change the person's decision?
Yes.
Very transiently, though.
But transiently, yeah, we know that's clear. Okay, very transiently. So basically, we have a window for when we use transcranial magnetic stimulation. We have a time window maybe of maximum 15 minutes, and then we are back to baseline. Otherwise, we wouldn't pass the ethical review board. So that's very important. Yeah.
Hi, as a practicing physician, I'm very invested in people's choices in their own health and healthy lifestyles, and it interfaces very much with the economics of healthcare. I'm wondering if there's any comments or research being done in incenting people or trying to incent people in choosing healthy lifestyles, and there's a huge economic impact, as we could prevent about 80% of chronic diseases by lifestyle choices. So I'm fascinated if there's any research being done in the intersectionality of choices, specifically healthy choices and lifestyles, and the economics of healthcare.
Sounds like a question for Ifat.
I know a little bit about that. I know that there are some studies where subjects or patients are actually paid in order to adhere to treatment, and it works great, and which seems very, it's AIDS patients, for example, that you'd think in order to stay alive, that should be a good enough motivation, and actually paying them and doing the economic approach of incentives helps a lot. There is some work on medical decision making and how these decisions might be similar or different from monetary decisions. And it seems, I think, from what we know today, is that some of it is similar and some is different. So, if someone is risk taker, likes uncertainty, chooses uncertain options, in one domain, it does tell us something about other domains, but not a lot. I think I absolutely agree with you that there is a lot of potential in this. It's an open field, I think.
I advise you to search Google for behavioral economics of preventive healthcare. So there's a whole subdiscipline in behavioral economics that deals with the question, how do we improve preventive healthcare? And it's one of the big challenges that is not yet solved. But there are tools out there that people try. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, thank you. So in economics, we explain people's behaviors through utility maximization. The utility function or preference function is given as assumed. But in neuroscience, it seems to me you are backing out the brain's activity from observable behavior. How can you? I wonder, it seems to me you're just trying to explain people's behavior from different perspective. And is there any link you can say? I can use neuroscience to specify the utility function or any kind of other function, so that it could be a breakthrough in the study?
I mean, currently, when it goes the other way around, I mean, we infer utilities from behavior, and then try to use these utilities as parametric regressors for our brain imaging data to identify the value encoding regions. Now, there may be, of course, in the long run, because let's assume we have established reliably value encoding regions. At that point in time, once you know that, you can use that knowledge itself without the behavior to infer utilities, okay? So for example, that's what they did, what Ifat did in one of their studies. Because we know the value encoding regions, they look at the brain activity in these value encoding regions during passive viewing. It has nothing to do with choices anymore. And still that brain activity predicts choice. So what does that tell you? Well, there appear to be utilities in the brain, independently of behavior, that you can measure with brain activity. And if these measurements become more precise over time, we do have tools to measure utilities in the brain. Yeah.
I think just to add a little bit to that, I think it's kind of an iterative process between economics and neuroscience, where we take things from economics that help us in neuroscience, and then hopefully neuroscience can help economics, and it can go back and forth like that. And in neuroscience, we are always very careful from doing what we call reverse inference. So saying, okay, this is an area that does X, and so if I saw activity in this area, let's say it's the fear area, and I saw that this area was active, that means the subject was afraid. We should be very, very careful about that, because the same brain areas often do a lot of things, and we don't understand enough to do that. But like Ernst said, in some cases, like in the about the value areas, we know so much already that we can start to also go in the opposite direction.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for now. We do welcome you all to come to the reception, and let's thank our speakers.